Hello, everybody. Scott Golden here, Golden Opportunities Coaching. Thank you to those of you who have been following the channel for a while. We've actually had a video land on the front page of some search engines, which means more people helped, which means we're closer to the 400 subscriber goal by the end of the month. We're halfway through the month. We only need 30 more people. I think we can pull that off. Maybe we get to 450. Who knows? Anyway, thank you to those of you who have been supportive. Please like, subscribe, comment if you like the content. If there's something that you'd like to hear about, please feel free to make that request. We'll see what we can do for you. In any event, we're going to talk about trauma today. One of the things I do is I am a trauma recovery coach. A little different than a counselor. In traditional counseling, they focus on diagnostics and the past. As a trauma recovery coach, I focus on helping people to move things forward for the future, retelling a new story about something negative that happened to them. So I'm really passionate about trauma recovery. I've been involved with the trauma recovery field now for about 16 years, 3 as an apprentice and 13 professionally, 14 in October. So in any event, I just want to talk about a few things, about 5 or 6 things about trauma that I think are important and I think people misunderstand or might not have as much information as they could have about. So trauma is when the brain, mind, spirit, and emotions are shocked by something in a way that changes the mindset or perception of a person for either a long-term span of time or an acute short-term span of time. Usually the effects of trauma are lasting in one way or another. They can also be used to change a person's worldview in a negative or positive way, depending on the effect. So trauma recovery is helping someone to find, through a difficult or shocking experience, a way that helps them to be progressive and positive after a shocking experience. So there's many things that can cause trauma events. So something as simple as a physical or sexual assault, living through a natural disaster, a robbery, some form of violent crime. All of these things are traumatic single events that can cause a person to change how they perceive and react to the world. These are the most common things, and many times people with traumatic events have several, although that's not always the case. It only takes one event to trigger things like PTSD, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and other social and mental disorders. It's been my experience after working with thousands of people in about 4 dozen countries that a person can have a predisposition to mental or emotional illness, but a trauma is used in about 95 to 97% of cases to open up that gateway to the illness. In other words, it can lay dormant, and then a traumatic experience happens, or a series of them happen, and then the pathways to the illness in the brain become open or more, think of it like inflamed or focused upon. Does this happen in every case? No, there are people that are born with genetic dispositions, and there is no trauma that brings it about. But 95 to 97% of people often go through a traumatic experience and then end up with emotional instabilities, mental instabilities, and the like. Now, there is recovery, but the treatment that a person receives immediately after, within 3 days to 7 days after a traumatic experience, is imperative to the recovery process. It can mean the difference between dealing with a trauma in a few months and dealing with a trauma in several years or decades. So it's important that a person seeks help when they've gone through a traumatic experience. And it's counterintuitive because while people process the grief or the shock from the trauma, it's difficult to know what they need, both for them and for those that are trying to help them. So offering them as many resources as possible, be they ministers, if they're religious, coaches, if they're non-religious but looking for a new perspective, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. All of these are options for a person who's gone through trauma, and a combination usually of traditional mental health and non-traditional methods is recommended for individuals who are dealing with a traumatic event, partially because sometimes medication to slow down thoughts can be helpful while one processes the event, But medication will never be a cure for trauma because a person has to relearn to trust themselves and to trust their environment and to retell themselves a different story about the original event in order to get to close to full recovery, if not full recovery. The second thing is it changes perception of the world around them. So if I've been in a car accident, even though I've driven, for years, I can immediately believe that all cars are unsafe, or all roads are unsafe, or all other drivers are unsafe. That is a change in perception because of a single event. Now, that perception isn't necessarily reality, but it's real to me. So then we get into the debate of, well, what is reality? People can have what's known as corporate reality, meaning the reality that other people see, and personal reality or perception, which is what they believe to be true. Both are true depending on who's looking at it. So while it's true to the person that is going through the trauma that all roads are unsafe because that experience makes them believe that, in that moment, that is their truth. No one can talk them out of it, and you have to slowly introduce alternatives in a non-threatening way of possibility, and then help a person shift to believing that other alternatives are possible, then that they're probable, then help them to embrace that probability as the reality. So it's a multi-tiered process helping a person to recover from trauma. I have long been an advocate for trauma recovery centers as opposed to traditional mental health hospitals, although the U.S. economy is propped up by the health industry, both mental health and physical health. So the likelihood of having trauma recovery centers in the way that people actually need them is minimal at best here in the U.S., although it's possible that it could happen other places. And I would even say trauma recovery centers would change the world dynamics greatly because more people could go back to work, more people could be engaged with their families, with their partners, and just have better quality of life. But a trauma recovery center in practice would look something like taking 6 months to 2 years away from the traditional world that is either charity or government sponsored or combination of both. The person relearns how to relate to the world in a way that is safe for them using many integrations of different therapeutic techniques, along with spiritual integration and relearning what things mean to them and getting to a place of safety. They come up with an action plan post-recovery. They come up with a story that is discernible and retellable for them about their traumatic experience, and then they go back into the world. The problem and the challenge with this is, A, it would be cost prohibitive in many cases, and B, many people who've been through a traumatic experience would believe that they're beyond help. So beginning to open a person to the idea that recovery is possible would have to be handled by a team of professionals who would then help them to integrate into, hopefully, a very peaceful environment, both inside and outside. And while it's possible for people to recover from trauma in less than 6 months, I put the 6 months marker out there because everyone heals at different levels. If a person's ready before that time, great. But depending on the level of trauma and number of traumas, it can take several months for a person to completely recover. Complete recovery is to be able to tell the story of, to be able to tell the story of an event without negative emotional impact upon their life to which they feel out of control. That doesn't mean they won't shed a tear or become upset, but it means they can regain control and return to natural living in a reasonable length of time, a few minutes, a few hours. That is trauma recovery, and it is possible for all people. Now, people can also have trauma issues because they have witnessed a traumatic event, be it a natural disaster, a storm, a violent crime, and all these things. The act of witnessing and being unable to stop the event, the act of witnessing and being unable to do anything can lead to witnesses' guilt, which is a thing that I think is underspoken about in the mental health community. Witnesses' guilt is, I should have been able to do something different. I should have been able to provide a solution. I should have been able to prevent this event. Now that reality or experience is just as traumatic for some people that they couldn't step in and change the course of events as it is for the person who's witnessing things. Think about children who've witnessed violent crime. Think about maybe people that have witnessed an accident. Maybe if they'd stepped forward one step sooner, they could have pushed someone out of the way of an oncoming vehicle. And that witness's guilt is just as traumatic for an individual as it is for the person who went through the incident itself. Now, that doesn't downplay the value of the victim, obviously, the survivor, but they're traumatic in different ways. The witness feels they could have done something differently. The victim feels they wish they'd been in a different place, different time, and somehow, is there anything they could have done differently to avoid the event? Obviously, abuse of any sort, mental, emotional, physical, sexual, financial, and other types are major causes of trauma. Obviously, feeling unsafe in one's environment is a gateway to opening up all sorts of mental and emotional instabilities. Also, issues with self-worth, self-hate, self-harm, all sorts of negative addictive behaviors and other things. So a person that's been through abuse, first of all, the abuse is the trauma. The reliving of the abuse, be it through flashbacks or retelling of stories or sensory reminders, is the reactivation of the abuse, and then again telling oneself a different internal story about maybe the reasons for the abuse or the strength it took to survive it. Shifting the focus away from what happened and what happened actually means or could mean for them, for their future and their present moment, is a pathway to recovery. The next reality is that these things can overlap. So a person can have multiple events in life, throughout life. They do not have to be close together. They do not have to be of the same type in order to have a traumatic effect. Also, people with abuse may have hundreds or even thousands of single events that lead to what's known as a trauma profile. Certain situations, certain words, certain experiences, certain sensory experiences can lead to flashbacks and retriggering of abuse. And for these individuals, it's exceptionally hard to come to a place of full recovery because they have to first forgive, although not tolerate, two separate things, what originally happened to them, tell themselves a new story about why it happened and what it could mean, and then come up with trigger responses that are healthy rather than unhealthy. It's a lot of work. That's why it takes months to years, because every person heals at a different rate, but recovery is almost always possible. Now, there are some people who will not engage in the recovery process. There are other people who believe they're beyond recovery, but in my experience, about 85% of people that have been through trauma are capable of a level of recovery that improves their quality of life. The 15 remaining percent either fall in one of two categories. Either they don't believe that recovery is possible, therefore they stall out, or they are so ashamed of what happened to them that they refuse to seek any form of treatment. And I guess a third one would be they've sought treatment before, it didn't help them, therefore they believe all treatment is the same. All treatment is not created equal, and working with sometimes several practitioners at either at the same time or separately is necessary for a complete recovery. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful to you. Until next time, keep your feet on the ground, your mind in the moment. Until next time, everybody.